But I'd really like to welcome you all to the first event that has been organised by our new UCL Centre for Research on the Dynamics of Civilisation, or CREDOC. I'm Maria Wyke from the Department of Greek and Latin and a co-director of the new centre alongside Mike Rowlands, who will be speaking in a minute, from the Department of Anthropology. We're really delighted at the interest that's been expressed in this event and our future ones, and we hope that interest will be sustained over the life of the centre, which should be, we hope, at least 3 years, if not more. But we do also know that many colleagues in UCL have thought that a UCL centre researching barbarism or anarchy would be a tad more interesting than civilization. And why, you may ask, should the concept of civilization be entitled to make a comeback into academic inquiry after decades in the dark? We hope this and our future events will demonstrate how the concept of civilization has come back into both political and popular debate and therefore needs renewed analysis, and also how, against its popular usage to articulate difference and hierarchy, the concept of civilization might be used ethically and even for the good. So if the concept of civilization interests you, there are a number of ways you could get involved with CREDOC. Do tell us about any relevant research projects you may have already on the go, if you haven't done so already. We would welcome suggestions from colleagues for civilizational events, and will soon be advertising to UCL academics a call for research grant proposals on civilizational issues. Our official launch lecture takes place on the 13th of February and concerns China's current self-identity as a 5,000-year-old civilization. But today, we wish to start with what we've called our first provocation. That is a conversation designed, we hope, to provoke debate. We take the concept of progress and consider the problems it has raised for the study of civilization, humanity, and life. Mike Rowlands from UCL Anthropology will speak first for the dynamics of civilization. James Steele from the Institute of Archaeology for Human Evolution, and finally Nick Lane from Genetics, Evolution and Environment for the Origins of Life. Life, humanity and civilization, these constitute 3 research groupings of UCL's research frontiers, and it's an important feature of UCL that we should be able to speak across the boundaries conventionally posed between the studies of the disciplines of chemistry, biology and culture. So now, to get things started, David Price, UCL Price Provost for Research, will begin the event, and we hope to close with plenty of opportunity for discussion. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to be here and to welcome you all to this event. My role as Vice Provost for Research is, for many, a totally opaque and obscure one. There are 2,300 now academic members of staff at UCL. There are 2,700 postdoctoral researchers. There's something like 5,000 PhD students. So that makes like 10,000 order of magnitude researchers. And it's obviously not my job to tell any one of them what to do or to direct them in any way. They're far more expert in their subject than I am. So my role is really to ensure that UCL is more than the sum of its parts. We have brilliant arts and humanities, we have brilliant economics, we have brilliant physical sciences, we have brilliant medical sciences. But as an institution, with all of that talent that we have, we should be saying, what can we do in addition to those disciplinary excellence activities? And so we've developed a research strategy at UCL, which is first and foremost based on the leadership and excellence that we have in the different disciplines. But secondly, we're endeavouring to do what we can to encourage cross-disciplinarity. That is, looking at questions that only can find solutions by bringing people together with expertise in different fields. And we use the word cross-disciplinarity to differentiate it from interdisciplinarity, which has often, if you like, had a bad press because it gives the suggestion that you may be if you like, a jack of all trades but a master of none. What we have is masters, many, 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 many world leaders. We want to bring those experts together and ask them to take a breath and look at a bigger question than the one that they're looking at today. And so we started by looking at UCL grand challenges, which were societally based challenges like global health or sustainable cities or intercultural interaction or human well-being. But then we also wanted to realize and recognize that actually asking some of the fundamental origins questions was as important for us in UCL as the, if you like, applied questions. So we started, I can't remember, but I think approximately we just started in my conversations with Nick Lane, who was a Provost Venture Fellow, on the origin of life, a question which can only be solved, if it can be solved, by bringing together, and perhaps Nick will tell us it has been solved, I don't know, but by bringing together experts with different disciplinary backgrounds, chemists, biologists, earth scientists, and others. Likewise, the other fascinating question, the origin of humanity. And James is developing a centre and a group around that. And then Maria came to me, well, it must be a couple of years now, and I think we've been developing these ideas on civilization. So today is the, if you like, bringing together of what we're looking at as, if you like, the balance to our grand challenges, that is our research frontiers, which are intrinsically cross-disciplinary, fundamentally important, intellectually stimulating, but hugely challenging, not only because they're difficult problems, but also actually bringing people together from different backgrounds to look at them are really quite challenging. And so I hope today we'll be able to have a debate on these big questions, but also how it is a university such as ours can address them and what we can do with our insights and our understanding. So I'm looking forward hugely to hearing what's going to be said, and I look forward to being provoked. So, Mike, can I pass over to you?
Thank you. Thank you for everybody being here. And as Maria said, this is a new centre with lots of questions about what we are going to do and what we will hope to achieve. And I think we wanted to start with a big issue, a big question that would perhaps sort of set a certain kind of agenda for us. So the problem of progress. And really in the 10 or 15 minutes I've got, I really want to address it as a concept, and a very deeply embedded concept. A concept which, after all, when we think about it in terms of its reconstitution in Enlightenment over the last 250 years, it is the master narrative of modernity. So progress is a master narrative. And it's a more powerful master narrative now, and certainly, sort of has been for some time, than any of the major world religions in terms of mobilizing just popular mass movement and anticipation of chosen futures. So progress is also about anticipation, and it involves choices being made, by people. Just a very brief anecdote. I've just come back from about a month's fieldwork in Cameroon, in West Africa, where I first started doing fieldwork there about 30 years ago. And I was there with the research assistant that I started with that time ago, and we were there really as we were there to participate in a ritual, a death celebration, turning one of our dead informants into an ancestor. So it was going to be a sort of very moving moment. We were both struck by how conservative this place was. It's on the borders of Cameroon and Nigeria, how conservative people were, how much the same it was as 30 years ago. We were all saying, well, it's just us, it's blah, blah, blah. But we gained more and more of this sort of sense of extreme conservatism. At the same time, there was endless discourse about progress and the lack of it, and the state not doing it. Progress was about tarmac roads, it was about hospitals, it was about teachers, it was about the physical entities of modernity, which they had or didn't have. But it wasn't about, themselves in the terms of what we saw as this conservatism in them. We then said, well, let's look at what they consume, and particularly consumer goods. And there's an interesting paradox. Chinese goods were everywhere. They were cheap. The cheapest Chinese goods go to Africa. And everybody said, Chinese, they look great, but they break. They're useless. What we like is second-hand European goods because we can mend them. Repairing and mending was what was important. One started to ask then questions in a month about mending and repairing. And what did it mean? And you then say, well, it's not about, everything gets repaired. There are Japanese cars in this part of the world. There's not a single Japanese part left in the car. Every part of it has been made in Nigeria or Cameroon and replaced in the mended car. It's that kind of world. You then extend out of that and you find that their social worlds are all about mending. It's a witchcraft world. Mending relationships and repairing relationships is a very strong theme. So the idea of progress is something which on the one hand is about morality, it's about the state, it's moral institutions, codes, texts, it's what the state, government, something like that should be doing. It should be about NGOs, it should be about the way in which humanitarian aid is administered, it's that kind of world. But then there's another world, the personal world of the ethical world, which is about mending and repairing. It's that paradox that led me to think really, what is this idea of progress and what are we using it for? I think over the last 200 years or so, there's been three major understandings of progress. And in a way, these three major understandings of progress have disseminated, sort of more or less at a global level now. That's why it has such a powerful resonance in terms of anticipating futures. The first of these understandings of progress basically can be they reconstituted in the Enlightenment. It's Hegel's writing on universal history. And Hegel's answer to what was progress was very straightforward. Hegel said progress is teleological and civilization is its carrier. The meta-thought of progress for Hegel was the development of the idea of freedom. So that in that sense, the idea of freedom becomes, not on a particular idea of freedom. We think of Isaiah Berlin or others, negative and positive contrasts of ideas of freedom in terms of freedom from constraint or freedom from self-realization. But progress was about the tracing of a universal history of progress as a redemptive meta-narrative based on good, on the achievement of goodness. And that idea of goodness was based on a logic of sacrifice. The sacrifice made by those in the past to ensure the emergence of higher forms of self-realization in the future. In other words, personal and collective experiences were joined spiritually and psychically in the idea of the good, in goodness. And particularly, it was achieved through suffering. So the link between suffering and good, and in this case, it's a moral virtue consistent with a sense of tradition, which is obviously, in this case, a Judeo-Christian one. Now, the outcome of progress in this sense is civilizational. It's about moral virtue. It's a rather Alistair MacIntyre kind of idea, perhaps, of civilization as a form of tradition. But it's also the challenges to that ideal, Nietzschean challenges, Freud's challenge, that all of which were then reinforced by a sense of catastrophe that led by the middle of the 20th century a dissolution of this idea that progress in this Hegelian sense, in this utopian sense perhaps. And we can sort of see it more as progress is a source of catastrophe. Very little quote from Theodor Adorno from his essays on history and freedom, where he says, "For progress today really does mean simply the prevention and avoidance of total catastrophe. And I would say that if only it can be prevented and avoided, that would be, in fact, progress." Think of climate change, and for Adorno, we're in a permanent age of catastrophe. And he would say climate change is exactly what he would be saying is our common environment. Progress, therefore, is how to avoid catastrophe. But the good, the idea of the good is retained. He won't give up on universal history quite. Who's influenced him, Walter Benjamin, does, but he doesn't. And again, interesting quote. In the age of catastrophe, the idea of progress cannot be conceived of as settling for less. Progress should no more be ontologized, unthinkingly ascribed to the realm of being, than should decline, with which, admittedly, modern philosophy appears to be more comfortable. Too little that is good has power in the world for the world to be said to have achieved progress. But there can be no good, not even a trace of it, without progress. He can't give up on the link between progress and good. And that we still haven't given up on. But by the time of Adorno, and certainly post-World War II, the theme of suffering and sacrifice had become too much. Hence his query in the quote, can one retain the link between progress and good? Progress and goodness. Universal histories come under suspicion. Meta-histories are seen as bad. One of, again, Adorno's classic quotes on that was, no universal history leads from the wild animal to the human being, but one indubitably leads from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. Progress is under suspicion now as a meta-narrative. And it's not about biological evolution, which we'll be hearing about, it's about technology in the service of domination. Now, this idea of progress as good, however, then gets displaced and moved. It gets moved and displaced into humanitarian aid and into development. It gets moved in the process of decolonization and post-colonial independence out of its origins to the third world in the 50s and 60s. Most recently, the link between progress and good is still there. You may have read Bill Gates' recent pronouncement in his 6th annual letter from the Gates Foundation, where he makes the bold prediction, by 2035, there'll be almost no poor countries in the world. And citing, I believe, a UCL Lancet Commission report on global health and climate change, he writes that by 2035, every country could have child mortality rates that are lower than the rate in the US or the UK in 1980. So moral virtue as goodness remains civilizational, but now it's cosmopolitanized. It's everywhere. Okay, my third transformation of progress has its base, I think, and we'll hear more today, in science. That is, progress as a set of epistemic principles and embedded, not embedded in kind of social traditions or some kind of idea of form of life. Instead, it nurtures life as something open, common to everybody within the realms of objectivity. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't preferences, nor that these epistemic principles are value-free. And therefore, goodness comes into that as well. And I will leave it to my colleagues to bring out more of what I think they will be saying. But that conviction that progress is science has one more implication, the growing disconnection between the dominating meta-narratives of progress that has disseminated in the way I briefly tried to describe over the last 250 years, and the micro-narratives of personal progress. What I would see, coming back to my anecdote, is the distinction between morality as codes, institutions, rules, something that the state, government, whatever should interfere, and this idea of ethics, the personal idea of one's own well-being and one's own goodness, one's own sense of progress. And what we witness is perhaps the disconnection between now these meta and these micro-narratives. What is really worrying is that the morality and the ethical are increasingly becoming disconnected from each other. Increasingly, as in my anecdote in Cameroon, I have this image of people who, on the one hand, look out to this disconnection with the state and government for things like tarred roads, hospitals, etc. But they look to somewhere else in terms of their own kinship groups. And the reason why I was there was for the continuation of one of these, in other words, a celebration of a new ancestor. That is, that's where they would find their own future. Now, all of this may be, besides the more general point, that this sense that I think of disconnection is about the transcending of boundaries. These are not matters of scale. The micro is not meta and micro, and it's not about, when I use the words morality and ethics in this way, it's actually against certainly my anthropological colleagues who would want to see only ethics and the ethical as a way of understanding progress. But I suppose as an anthropologist, I'm prone to look for answers to these questions, sort of not in where I think I belong, but elsewhere, in the past and elsewhere. And in that, I'm really looking at where this disconnection that I'm particularly worried about, in the sense of the lack of perhaps the sense of one's own ethical concern with the future in these major themes of catastrophe that Adorno addresses. One of them is climate change. The disconnection between all the evidence for that, the overwhelming evidence of that, and the personal. And I end on another little anecdote. A person that I know's mother lives in Scunthorpe. When Mandela died, she rang her mother up, and her mother said, "Oh, why is there all this stuff about Mandela dying? What did Mandela do for me? Don't they know that it's raining here in Scunthorpe? There's floods, and we're putting sandbags in front of our doors." There's these kind of senses of disconnection which worries me about the whole way in which the future of the idea of progress, has evolved at the present time. Thank you. Jane?
Thank you, Mike. And I'm going to follow on this by just giving some brief pointers to some of the concepts, some of the part of the map of ideas that we examine when we're talking about human evolution that relate to this theme of the problem of progress. And so, to some extent, we'll need to do some work in the discussion to try and see how to put these all together into a coherent history of ideas and situating where we're going in the future. Of course, when we're thinking about human evolution, we have to deal with the legacy of 19th century and earlier progressive ideas. And I've got on the left here Haeckel's picture from his book on the evolution of man, of the human pedigree with man at the top there. And his theory of evolution was also one that was, in a sense, progressive. And indeed, he had this recapitulationist view that more advanced forms recapitulated in their own individual ontogenetic development the adult stages of less advanced forms of life. And certainly it's also familiar just within the human lineage to think of, and this has become a sort of iconic image that gets regularly spoofed, to think of a walk, a steady walk in a direction. And it's typically males who are doing the walking. Okay. But in a sense, this is a legacy which is anagenetic. That's to say it's a single linear developmental progression in evolution, and in some cases to do with certainly freighted with some arguments about advancement and primitiveness. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, sorry. In the last 50 years, I think it's true to say that any residue of that thinking within the science of genetics and of paleoanthropology has been comprehensively discarded. And in terms of the genetics, even 50 years ago, we might have been thinking that the humans represented a grade, a level of behavioral organization that was sufficiently distinct from that of the great apes to have, to enable us to interpret the fossil record, fragmentary as it was, as implying a deep split going back into the early Miocene, with ourselves as a family in the taxonomic hierarchy, the hominids, That's why we used to call ourselves ids at the end, distinct from the great apes who must form a separate branch. And one of the great contributions of the geneticists has been to show us that that's not the case, that the, if you like, the grade does not map well onto the actual branching pattern of human evolution, where we find ourselves in a group, in terms of the history of the branching evolution of our lineages, with the chimpanzees. And we're each more closely related to each other than either is to the gorillas and a fortiori to the other great apes, the orangutans. So that's been a very useful, not only for the chronology and understanding, but also because the understanding of the branching pattern clearly separates, if you like, grades from the clades or the empirical pattern. Paleoanthropology has meanwhile given us enormous insight as the fossils have accumulated into what has become clear is an enormous radiation of diverse forms of hominin, as we now call our own lineage since the last common ancestor with chimpanzees because of our demotion, as it were, down the taxonomic hierarchy. And if you look here, this is one of the characteristic charts that Bernard Wood's group produces, and we have a time axis on the bottom going from older, roughly the time of the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee, to the present day, and each of these bars represents a separate species as classified from the fossil morphology with its duration represented by the length of the bar. And what Bernard Wood has tried to do here is by giving different colour shadings to indicate something about the characteristic behavioural adaptation, which you may see in the key up there. And there we are at the very top left. Despite these fantastic contributions from the accumulation of knowledge and the thinking about how to systematically organise it in terms of descent relationships, there are, however, still some ways in which hominin evolution is thought about as having some directional trends. And it's not at all unusual to see one of the major features of human evolution, the evolution of the brain, still represented as a vector that has magnitude, the increasing capacity of the brain against time, and in which the species diversity is, as it were, collapsed into a single value, the brain size. So I think it's fair to say that for many people, behaviourally, we're still thinking about, I don't know if it's progressive, a directional trend that this kind of graph shows us. And perhaps we don't know enough because we're simply dealing with the volumes of cavities in the fossil record to differentiate within that if there are any specific behavioural adaptations reflected in brain organisation. The archaeologists are still wrestling with the legacy of a lineal progression model of technological modes, as we call them, in the stone tool record. And you may still find attempts to match up species with modes, although I think that's doesn't have much future. Modes representing levels of organisation of the sequence of production of a stone tool of a different type, from the older one associated with Olduvai Gorge through the hand axes of the Acheulean hand axe on the top left, and so on. When we think about the appearance of anatomically modern humans, there are also some provocations, if you like, to be had in the way we use our language. Certainly with the contributions from mitochondrial and now Y chromosome genetics, it's reasonable to think that we all share a very recent common ancestry in a population that dispersed out of Africa. You will see there's plenty of debate now about levels of admixture, whether the morphological species that we define in other parts of the old world may have been capable of fertile interbreeding. But nevertheless, the story of a late out-of-Africa model for the dispersal of modern, as we call them, humans appears robust. And indeed, we do use terminology that you may find relevant to this symposium. We talk about the human revolution associated with the appearance of a spectrum of behaviours in the archaeological record associated with what we call anatomically modern and indeed behaviourally modern Homo sapiens. Okay. So it seems to me this terminology is relevant to our thinking here. And of course, Jared Diamond has spoken of the great leap forward in relation to this emergence of a complex of distinctive behaviours that's associated with a ratcheting up of the rate of accumulative cultural evolution. And there are plenty of people who would still think with Chomsky that maybe there's some discontinuity that may have some genetic basis that relates to the emergence of a linguistic capacity, perhaps with our own species. In addition to that, we are increasingly recognizing there's a hot topic at the moment, directional trends, or the potential for thinking about directional trends in cultural evolution. And a topic that's much debated and published on at the moment is the idea of cumulative cultural evolution. The idea is here that we may be the only species among living primates that can accumulate across generations learned behaviors such that, as you know, that what we learn as individuals may be beyond our capacity to have reinvented independently by trial and error learning. And there's been a wealth of studies of the cognitive basis for the differentiation of our own ability, the predisposition to engage in collaborative social interaction, to read each other's intentions, to communicate, to build shared understanding, that may differentiate us from chimpanzees and from other primates, that may underwrite this capacity to cumulatively ratchet up our cultural histories. And an example of this, a study that came out in Science about 5 years ago, suggested that when you compare 2.5-year-old kids with adult chimpanzees and orangutans, the idea being that in some way this age contrast reflects comparable levels of cognitive development in some broad sense across species, tasks that are in, as it were, the physical domain, we show comparable performance, but in a social domain, and in particular in behaviors that represent some of the toolkit for acquiring behavior culturally from one another, the kids show a significant offset and improvement in performance in that domain. I've rather lost track of time, but this is in fact my concluding slide. Clearly, we've moved on from biological, anagenetic, progressive thinking. We now recognize the contingency of some of the branching events at our own lineage, branching off from a common ancestor with chimpanzees, with different rates of divergent adaptive evolution. We recognize from the fossil record an enormous diversity of explorations, as it were, of irradiation of forms of hominin life. Yet at the same time, we still think about a directional trend in brain size that may underwrite some cognitive capacities. We still often talk about the appearance of our own species, which we now know to be late, as associated with what we call behavioral modernity, with a revolution, perhaps associated somehow with symbolic thinking, symbolic culture. It's fairly clear that we have cognitive specializations that predispose us to acquire culturally learned information. And yet at the same time, that opens up for consideration the idea that as a species, we may always, not just in science, but as a species, have been able to see further by standing on the shadows of giants because of the way in which cultures learn across generations by accumulating knowledge. And what may differentiate the rest of us from the scientific endeavour may simply be the balance of learning strategies between the ground truthing through trial and error and the dependence on other cues from how many other people are doing a behaviour or their status as to whether we should adopt it without further examination. I hope that there are in that brief package of information some ideas about progress concepts that we've got rid of, some directional concepts that are still there that will be useful for the discussion. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this meeting.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not really going to talk about the origin of life as such. It will be quite difficult to say, is it progress to go from non-living to living? I suppose you could ask a stone or something. But so what I'm going to talk about more is early evolution and the way in which we've gone from non-cells to cells and then on to more complex cells, because there is undoubtedly a sense of accumulating complexity over evolutionary time Is that progress or not? Well, we have to look at exactly how that pattern works. So it's quite a toxic word in biology, progress. It takes most people straight back to the idea of the scala naturae, some sense of a great chain of being. It's very teleological. Nature is somehow striving to get closer towards God. And the angels are just underneath God, and then underneath there is man, and down here we're down with minerals and things. This is Haeckel again. We saw a picture from Haeckel. This is even more teleological. We start off with amoeba at the top, and we work our way through, and we end up with modern humans. So this is the idea of biology that really was prevalent in the 19th century, and is completely dismissed. It's something closer to that, I think, is the modern view of biology. There is no real direction about it. So another problem with the idea of progress is design, because design is another difficult word in biology. There is really no such thing as design. Richard Dawkins talks about designoid, which is a horrible word, but you see what he's getting at. Plainly, a heart is a pump. The cardiovascular system is serving a purpose. But as soon as we start talking about purpose in biology, we run into all kinds of problems. Again, it implies a designer, and it suggests teleology. So we have to be very careful with our terminology. But because evolution is basically blind, it has no foresight, there is no direction about evolution. There can be, nonetheless, a direction over time, and that comes from natural selection itself. But does a lack of foresight and direction mean a lack of progress? I don't think it necessarily does, but we do have to define these terms with some care. So essentially, natural selection is not random. Natural selection is selecting the adaptations that work best and eliminating the ones that don't work as well. And so you can adapt to a selective landscape, to the peaks of an adaptive landscape over time, and that implies some sense of progress in itself. But very often that doesn't happen. This is another, we tend to be bedazzled by large objects like ourselves. There's a rule known as Cope's rule. He had a great middle name, Edward Drinker Cope. I mean, what were his parents thinking of? So he has this rule that over evolutionary time, a lot of animals tend to become larger, so the populations become larger over time, and the smaller sized animals tend to disappear. And you see that with the pliosaurs there. So going back 200 million years ago, tiny little pliosaur there down at the bottom. They become enormously large around about 120 million years ago. They tail off a little bit more recently. This has been disputed, though, over a long time, and there was a paper from about 15 years ago now from David Jablonski. He ends up saying, directional net increase in body size, including the loss of small-sized species, is no more frequent than an increase in size range among species or a net evolutionary size decrease. And so what he meant by that is it doesn't exist. There is no, in the fossil record, there are some animals which become larger, some which become smaller, and some which just increase their range, and they have both larger and smaller. So we tend to see things in the fossil record that we want to see, things which get larger and apparently more complex, and very often exactly the opposite happens. Now, this was a big theme for Stephen Jay Gould. He really didn't like the idea of progress. There's a nice quote from him there. We grasp at the straw of progress, a desiccated ideological twig, because we're still not ready for the Darwinian revolution. So he talked about the drunkard's walk theory of complexity. So he has a drunk there standing by the bar, and the drunk kind of staggers around and collapses in a heap at some point. Well, there's a kind of frequency distribution of where he's going to collapse. He's more likely to collapse somewhere in the vicinity of the bar. He might make it as far as the gutter, but basically it depends on where you start, was his point. And same for life. We're starting simple, necessarily. We're starting with simple single cells. And they can't become more simple. They can remain where they are, but necessarily the only direction that they can go in is to become more complex. So he dismissed the whole idea of a direction and simply said it's a kind of a stagger around, and we just find certain things become more complex because there's space there where they can. The other difficulty we have is defining what on earth complexity, or let's assume complex organisms are in some way superior, represent progress over simpler organisms. There was a professor of zoology at UCL in the 19th century, Ray Lancaster, There he is. You may recognize that picture. That's in the Grant Museum as it was in 1890 or thereabouts. It's still the same today, although they've moved the actual museum across. Now, he was quite obsessive about parasites. He described them as degenerate. Just as an active, healthy man sometimes degenerates when he becomes suddenly possessed of a fortune, or as Rome degenerated when possessed of the riches of the ancient world, the habit of parasitism clearly acts upon animal organization in this way. Let the parasitic life once be secured, and away go legs, jaws, eyes, and ears. Now, we tend to still think of parasites as being essentially degenerate and unpleasant in some way. There's a great book. If you haven't read that book by Carl Zimmer, Parasite Rex, it's absolutely wonderful. The kind of adaptations at the level of cells and biochemistry to survive in a serial hosts and to evade their immune system and so on. There's a complexity in there which is a completely different order of complexity to anything we're used to, really. And so it's almost impossible to define what complexity is. We can't simply define it in the number of cells or something. Incidentally, Lancaster himself was pictured as in Vanity Fair. They obviously thought he was somewhat degenerate himself from the way they've painted him. So another issue is we have a problem with continua. We can't really define progress if we can't define our terms. So is a virus alive or not? You can't say. A lot of people would say it's not alive. It looks alive in the way that these viruses are attacking a bacteria in that case. They behave as if they're alive. They behave with some sense of purpose, but they don't have a metabolism of their own, and they're entirely dependent on other cells for their living. So really, life is like pornography. We can't define it. We just recognize it when we see it. It's really difficult to come up with a valid definition for life. And that means that the origin of life as well is also extremely difficult. It's basically a whole series of continua. And it was very nicely put by Christian de Duve, who wondered about how proto-metabolism came to be replaced by metabolism. So going from geological systems to biological systems, the obvious answer to this question, he says, is that the appearance of catalysts, whether ribozymes or protein enzymes or both, was responsible for the transition. But we have to ask, how did catalysts with appropriate properties come to appear? And the only scientifically plausible explanation is that catalysts arose through selection. That's really quite a reasonable thing to say, it seems to me. But then enzymes are selected only if they fit into proto-metabolism. And so there must be a continuity between geochemistry and biochemistry, and so there must be a continuum. And it's very, very difficult to know at what point you say this is alive and that's not alive. It's a completely pointless question, but then we do not have a definition, and so we can't define what is progress or what is not. A major point from that, though, is that once you have cells, as Darwin himself realized, they're going to take over everything. They're so much better at what they do, at replicating copies of themselves, than some geological system is, that they take over the world. And so there's a ratchet there. This is the first ratchet, you might say, and there's no going back from that. So this theme was famously laid out by John Maynard Smith and Urs Schathmary in a book called The Major Transitions of Evolution, and they see each of these transitions as being a transition in the level of organization. So we start off with replicating molecules, going to populations of molecules within cells. And there's a series of 7 or 8 of these. The last one is primate societies going to human societies with language. The one that I'm most interested in is apart from the origins of life, is prokaryotes to eukaryotes. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. Maynard Smith also, though, was at UCL. This picture is from when he was a little older, when he was at the University of Sussex. Here he is when he was at UCL. Quite a different looking character in those days. One other thing to say about this slide, actually, is it's not simply levels of organization in terms of replication and genes and so on. There's also big environmental factors. So we have photosynthesis, for example, producing oxygen. It's a ratchet point. As soon as there's oxygen in the world, then you can have large animals that need oxygen, essentially, to run around and do things. We can have predation. There's ratchets and all the way up that once you've got that level, you don't have to go to that level, but suddenly a whole new world opens up for you. So, in my mind, the biggest transition, the most awkward and difficult transition, goes from what are known as, well, from prokaryotes, bacteria, like this is quite a complex bacterium here, to the eukaryotes. The eukaryotes, we're eukaryotes who've got large cells with a nucleus, lots of DNA. You know, this is a bog standard alga, so the kind of thing you'd find in a pond on Hampstead Heath. But it's enormously complex at the cellular level. You don't need to know what any of that stuff is to realize that this is progress compared to that. Really, we've gone somewhere else. The trouble is that bacteria, the whole planet was bacterial for 2 to 3 billion years. There was no obvious progress. It got stuck in a rut, you might say. And suddenly these eukaryotic cells arose around about 1.5 billion years ago. And then you know, plants, animals, fungi, everything arose from the common ancestor. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up here. Right. So this is a tree of life. Just to give a sense of the bacteria, great domain, all of those branches give an indication of genetic variation. The archaea, they look a lot like bacteria. Again, a lot of genetic variation in their biochemistry and their genes, they're very different. Here are the eukaryotes. There's us right at the top, that little point of animals up there, still even depicted at the highest point of the graph. But essentially, over 4 billion years, we have enormous variety. We have almost infinite genetic variation and infinite population sizes, but they came up with bacteria and archaea. They look like that. They're morphologically very simple. We never got to a laughing elephant. Is that progress? In my mind, that's progress. But what on earth was going on down here that wasn't going on over there? Now, a lot of genomic evidence suggests that something like that happened. So we have a genomic chimera. So we have 2 major domains of life, the bacteria and the archaea, and one of them got inside the other one. And it was that event that gave rise to the eukaryotes, to all complex cells. So this might be the starting point. These are cells within a cell. This is a bacterial cell. It's a cyanobacterium. But the origin of complex life started somewhere like that, and it immediately begs the question, what good is that? Why is that somehow better than bacteria without cells living within them? Well, I can't go into an answer here except to say that the cells within them went on to become the mitochondria. Their genomes became smaller and smaller. So effectively, we have multiple bacterial power, but the overheads, the costs of those bacteria reproducing themselves, became lower and lower as they lost genes. As they lost genes, a lot of them accumulated in the nucleus, allowing the nucleus to expand. And so you can actually work out the energy available per gene. These are 3 different types of bacteria. One of them, these 2 are giant bacteria, compared with Euglena, which we just saw, and an amoeba. And this is a log scale, so it's 3 or 4 orders of magnitude difference in energy available per gene. And that simply comes about from the fact that we've got mitochondria and bacteria don't. So this is the final slide then. That's the starting point. It's a ratchet. It allowed something to happen which could never have happened without it. Would you define that as progress? That is probably symbolically the single moment of greatest kind of pregnant progress in the entire history of our planet. But in what sense can you say that that's really a significant leap forward? So progress really is the wrong term altogether. I think that perhaps it's time to abandon it. There is direction because there are ratchets. And once you have a wider world that you can explore, then natural selection, even if it staggers around like a drunkard, will explore that entire realm. And so over time, we do see something that looks a lot like progress, but I think we understand it a lot better if we can somehow break it down into the component parts and try and understand exactly what happened, which is really the process of history as much as it is of biology. So I'll stop there.
And discussion.
If we're going to talk about progress, surely we have to appreciate that we may be progressing towards many different sorts of things. I mean, we might mean progress towards diversity, or progress towards ability to fly, or swim, or do mathematics. And that's the first point I want to make, that it can mean many different things depending on what we take the goal to be. And the second point is that it seems to me Nick Lane is absolutely right, that discerning progress doesn't mean that what is going on is itself progressive, that it's teleological, that there is something that intends the progress. evolution is blind. It isn't a process that has a goal in that sense. But nevertheless, we can look at a whole lot of processes and say, well, has the ability to fly developed or not during this interval of a million years or a billion years? So it seems to me that, of course, inevitably there's going to be endless progress in evolution, totally unproblematically. I mean, one of the things we might mean is simply progress in diversity of life. Well, if we mean by if that's what we mean by progress, then there's been massive progress from the origins. So I'm rather puzzled by this incredible unease that you biologists seem to have.
I think the difficulty
about talking about progress. It doesn't seem to be problematic at all.
I think the difficulty is as soon as you try and define things, you try and say, okay, so we've progressed from here to here or something, so you must define your terms. And those terms are very, very slippery. So it's obvious that the world is a completely different place now in terms of life compared to what it was 2 billion years ago. And I would see that, yes, in terms of progress, but what does that actually mean? It's just a word that's almost completely meaningless.
It could be many different things.
And you can define it in all kinds of terms.
Yeah,
but as I say, with parasites, is that progress or is that degeneration?
It entirely depends on what you... To live with minimal means might, one possible notion of progress.
I was taken by the... Is that right?
Yes,
Yes, that's good. I was taken by the interchange of the word progress and complexity. And by looking at complexity, perhaps you take out some of the, if you like, problems that you were alluding to in the sort of the motivational aspect. Because complexity is something you can try to assess objectively. And is it perhaps even related to some elements of irreversible thermodynamics, that if you have a system with energy imbalances, you will develop complexity. And is what we're seeing in all the evolution and society and brain power development just increased complexity?
Would perhaps either James or Mike like to make a comment about that distinction between progress and complexity? We only have 3 mics, I'm afraid.
Very simple.
Complexity seems to me to be quite a difficult concept. It potentially has a quantitative definition by the variety of different ones. I agree with you that it may take us away from some of the baggage that the concept of progress carries with it. I'm not. I mean, what do you understand by complexity, David?
What do you mean by me?
Shall we? Good.
Well, I share Nick's concerns that this is a bit of a semantic quagmire, frankly. I mean, of course, you're all aware that in 5 billion years or so, the sun will go red giant, and that will be the end of planet Earth. So, would the panel agree that we are progressing towards annihilation? Or would you say, oh no, what you've just done is you've defined progress as the arrow of time. We don't need that word at all. Well, I think Nick's right. I think there is this rather sort of dirty association with the word intention, that somehow progress means someone intended to get from A to B. And that is tied up with this notion of complexity. I mean, perhaps Nick can correct me on this, but as I understand it, a banana has both more chromosomes and more genes than a human being.
I'm not certain if that's true, but a paramecium does, for example. That's a single-celled protist, for people who don't know. I mean, I think the issue really comes down to teleology, which you were talking about at the beginning, and it's mixed up with morals. And to me, as a biologist, morals must come from biology in some way, because we are a product of biology. So culture can overwrite all of that, of course it can. But if we have any sense of right or wrong or good or any of those things, where do they come from? Traditionally, they come from God. But if there isn't a God, if there's only evolution, then this is one of the reasons why it's such a problematic area. This is one of the reasons why the whole idea of teleology has been cut out of biology, partly because it really does not exist, and partly because it gives you it gives you a moral quagmire. And to me, it seems obvious that any sense that we have of right or wrong comes from a social context and social interactions between chimpanzees or early humans or whatever it may be, and it must be conditioned by that. That doesn't mean to say it's only that, but that's where it came from. Is that progress?
So perhaps Mike could come in there on this issue of complexity versus progress, and on the issue of the intervention of morality in the debate.
Yes, I think the interesting distinction is what David said about progress is motivated. In other words, the interesting point is that if we have an idea of progress and it has some kind of idea that it's anticipatory, then the interesting question is, can a cell think? Can a cell, sort of have the motivation to anticipate what it would be best in a particular setting or in a particular idea of future? And if so, then we have obviously some interesting dilemma, because we want to say that the idea of the ethical or moral or the motivated idea of progress is innately human, or what it is to be human. So when James, sort of points out the cumulative learning, what the small child could do, that the monkeys or the apes couldn't do, etc., we're making that absolute distinction. Not only because in some kind of measurable way of cognitive ability, but also that there's some idea about motivated behavior or intentional behavior which is found in the child, which is not found in the apes or monkeys or whatever. And therefore we're making our own moral distinctions in that way. And that's where, the point about complexity is that complexity gets us off the hook, because we can then somehow turn it into a measurable thing, or to something that is open to, some kind of empirical investigation. But don't fool ourselves. We are just getting ourselves off the hook.
On that note, shall we have another question?
Yes. I just want to introduce two words, narrative and history, both of which come in any case simply with the passage of time. And it might be interesting to historically situate these discrete ideas of progress, including in the present, and the reasons for this current discussion, in addition to just pointing out that there are as many narratives of decline historically as there have been of progress. That's been very strong. For example, the discovery of the New World in the 15th century was imagined as the possibility of rescue precisely from such a moral decline. So,
I think progress is simply a meta-narrative. Secondly, it's a massive narrative. It's the most powerful and most overwhelming narrative form that we've had in 200 years.
is there an alternative way of thinking?
Well, there's ways of thinking about it in terms of the dissolution. That there is simply, it's not the story we want to have. It's just not the way we want to have the narrative. So we can have our own personal narratives, or we can have something which will dissolve it. And we work, and maybe that's what we're doing here. So I don't see the biology as separate from that. I think the biology is a narrative. I mean, that's why you do such a wonderful, you both do wonderful performances, actually, with the PowerPoint. It's a narrative. Great stuff.
That's what we're doing. You might better just make a comment on that, because there's two ways of seeing science. One of them is as a collection of facts in some way, and then trying to inductively infer things from the facts. Now, a lot of people don't think that's how science works at all. I don't. I see science as being driven by hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis, as Peter Meadow said, is a leap into the unknown, an imaginative leap into the unknown. And it's essentially storytelling. We try to construct a narrative. What's different about science is that you then try to test that narrative, and you try to see, does it stand up to scrutiny in the world? And this Popperian view of testing different hypotheses, which are essentially different stories, to see does it stand up to reality or not. We discard the ones that don't, we keep the ones that do, is very similar to natural selection. And most people would say science has progressed. over hundreds of years. Maybe we produce a nuclear bomb and destroy ourselves, but still, because we have the same kind of ratchet that natural selection itself has, it can lead to a directionality. And I think science and society, in that sense, have a directionality. And it comes from storytelling, it comes from narratives, it comes from testing those narratives and finding a way of ratcheting up knowledge. And that's exactly the same, that's how a bird manages to fly. It ratchets up various adaptations over tens of millions of years. So I think we're a storytelling animal, and that's where science is coming from.
In that context, James, did you want to say anything about the storytelling dimension and the historical layers in the process of analysing whether there's progress or diversity and complexity?
I suppose I've been thinking a couple of things in response to your point. The first is that in terms of our own stories, there may be a trade-off between coherence and the level of detailed knowledge that we have. That the more we know, the less coherent or simple the narratives are. I'm also thinking that, for example, with the projection of intentionality onto the natural world, that may be a natural extension of our ability to read each other's minds. So I'm wondering whether some of the expectation of an intention in the direction of change is something we tend to be stuck with until it's closely analysed. I am also thinking, just to come back to Nick's point about storytelling animals, about the strand in psychology, called narrative psychology. It's about the way in which this is a very effective device for organising information that's constructing causal understanding. So I'm sorry that's not a single answer to your point, but we are a storytelling animal. That's an interesting thread there. We do tend to attribute intentions to each other, and also, as a consequence of that, to other agencies. And it's certainly the case with some of the points I was making. As somebody who works in this area, I would like to not use those simplifying concepts, because I think it's intrinsically interesting to think about, for example, cognitive diversity within the hominids, rather than aligning them on a single scale for brain size. So my tendency is to challenge those narratives and present them because they were nevertheless quite compelling simplifying concepts that are out there.
I think our next question is coming from here.
It's more a comment. I'm looking at this review as a psychologist, so it's a totally different dimension perspective for the three of you. And I sort of sense that the three perspectives are not reconcilable. We're sort of trying to create an average temperature in hospital. And to me it's more interesting, because you created this cross-disciplinary center, maybe it's more useful to look at how two disciplines can formulate research questions that, I don't know, answer to something towards complexity, and then you will find your term. Because, for example, I'm researching psychosocial complexity in human adults, and I'm drawing on cognitive neuroscience and cultural studies. So there's definitely some useful research questions from two very different biological and cultural anthropological perspectives. What is question? What are the examples of the research questions you could be asking across your disciplines to make the debate more useful?
Mike, do you want to begin by suggesting one we can ask each of you?
I would take up this sort of the issue of the distinctions around what James talked as reliable knowledge, or this idea of cumulative knowledge as an example. If you take it as the idea of the cultural and the bio, and increasingly the bio and the cultural in some kind of post-humanist sense are constantly being engaged with each other, then it doesn't actually help to see it only in terms of degrees of something called reliability, why we can trust something in terms of, say, you talk about reliable knowledge or something that we accumulate. I would imagine there's the archaeological bias here, i.e. what is there in the record that you can trust, and therefore that you can have not only the long time span over, but also that you can trust in terms of the patterns, that you can detect, have some kind of reliability in relationship to concepts which are derived from sort of cognitive, particularly sort of behaviour, and ones which will allow you to link it to a materiality of things, and therefore the nature of the person-thing relationship can be articulated. Now that's the kind of discourse that one can enter into. So I don't actually accept, your characterisation of here, because I think that one is only in a way, just banging around with the idea that, as we've all seem to have agreed, that is, we're addressing stories to each other, from our particular points of view and perspectives. I think there's something actually quite interesting, in that. And there's also something quite interesting in challenging, sort of what kind of stories we want to have and we don't want to have.
Nick, you look like you're anxious to respond to that.
I think different disciplines have different ways of thinking about what amount to quite similar questions. So, I mean, the question of progress is implicit in all of these disciplines, and we've all dealt with it historically in quite different ways. And very often we don't know what other people think about it. And in the past, my father was a historian, and I grew up in a family where history was kind of around me. And now I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I tend to think in historical terms. I'm trying to reconstruct a narrative. I want to know what happened. Pretty much as my dad would want to know what happened that led to the Second World War. Or I want to know what happened that led to the origin of the eukaryotic cell or the origin of life or something. It's a narrative. You try to find the evidence. And when you're looking historically at what happened on Earth, there are straightforward scientific ways of testing questions which you perhaps don't have in history, but there are also ways of assessing evidence in history that very often scientists wouldn't think about. There's also philosophy, for example. I mean, I don't know much philosophy, but I remember reading Dan Dennett some years ago and being amazed at the acuity of his questioning. That was the one thing I took away from that book. I have no idea if I agreed with him or not, but he was asking questions that I hadn't even thought to ask. So I think what I really benefit from this is that it brings other ways of seeing problems which have something in common. You may or may not gain from it specifically, but it freshens up your own way of thinking. Maybe you have something to offer, maybe you don't, but without that juxtaposition, you get stale in your own world. So I think it's vital for that. David must have things to say about this.
I've got things to say about something related to that. Because I was actually just thinking about the title of your new entity, Dynamics of Civilization. And I just wondered whether, in fact, you could have stable dynamics of civilization, or whether, going back to the question, you raised the if you like, inevitability of the end of everything.
I'm sorry about it.
It's always good to have a downer, isn't it? But, I mean, should we be that lucky to get that far? I mean, sort of the complexity of behaviour of hominids, based on our evolutionary characteristics, are we actually able to have a stable civilization? Perhaps the one thing you've learned from civilizations is that they fail.
Jane, and then we'll get back to the question.
I'm tempted to bring in some of the archaeologists in the audience who are working on the stability of early agricultural societies and also on the cumulative evolution of populations. And Stephen, I don't know if you want to do one.
Thank you. Just put you on the spot there.
I don't know, I mean, one of the things we're beginning to pick up as we, for example, the particular thing I've been focusing on is histories of demographies with the appearance of farming, for example. And the standard view has tended to be that once farming appeared in societies, populations grew and civilization swallowed and so on. And what we've actually found as we've started to look at the evidence is that the populations crash after a period of time. So rather than being a kind of steady progress, what you get is a kind of series of booms and busts, where you are, to some degree, as it were, kind of going backwards to some extent, you could argue. So I think a lot of what we need to do, at least from the ontological point of view, is to start looking for the dynamics. And the dynamics, I think, are not always what we find. The kind of progress is not always what we find. And so I think the archaeology does give us a rather different picture, a potential different picture on this. when we actually start looking at some of the evidence, it does away with some of the standard assumptions.
Whereas if you have progress as a meta-narrative, it's not going to worry at all if it's boom or bust. It's still going to carry on. I mean, that's what a meta-narrative does. It anticipates, just like 2008, you know, it's a bust. But so what? I mean, the whole anticipation is capitalism will progress, it will go on, and it will. We hope not, maybe. But that's the point about this narrative form of progress. We can't just slip into saying, oh well, the pattern shows a boom and bust. Therefore, there's no progress, because that's not the point of the meta-narrative.
So I'm thinking back in terms of narratives, meta-narratives, metaphors, and all these things, and this power that we have when we have ideas that come from one field to the other. So I can imagine, for instance, the idea of progress in terms of if I'm building a company and I want to achieve a goal and I make progress towards that goal, that's obviously progress. If I'm a drunk and I say, well, I started out here and now I'm here, and I could draw an arrow and say, wow, look how far I've gone, look at my progress. You know, so there's a question, is that type of meta-narrative or metaphor or whatever useful? And the worry that I have is that once a metaphor jumps from one field to another, it's awfully hard to get rid of it. You know, so you have teleology, you have progress, you have selfishness. If we're not selfish, then our genes are. You know that, and once you get these things, it structures so much of your thought that becomes so wedded with your analysis that it's not disprovable. And that's, how do you prevent that dynamic from taking place?
Yeah, I mean, writing books, I use metaphors, and they worry me because you're absolutely right. If you want to try and make an idea clear, and especially to yourself, you tend to find a metaphor, and you look over the last few hundred years at the kind of metaphors people use, and you go from clocks to computers and things, and obviously none of them are like the human mind. But we try to interpret it in those terms, and so we're kind of looking in the wrong direction while trying to understand it in terms of what society has around at the time. And how do you dissociate yourself from that? Again, I'm not certain that we can. Because again, it comes back to this narrative animal thing. I'm not sure that we can dissociate ourselves from the world around us, which is probably another reason why Darwin and Wallace come up with the same idea at essentially the same time, based on thinking about population growth and Malthus and so on. What's happening around you in society conditions the way that you think about it, and that changes over time. And maybe some things just happen to work, and an idea like natural selection works then. Now we see it very differently in many ways, but the central thought is still there. The metaphor and the analogy still works, albeit now with more modifications. So I think overall it's a positive thing, but you have to worry about it because you could be deluding yourself.
Well, the selection which you mentioned is particularly interesting because that does tend to make you think in terms of agency. And obviously when one is dealing with civilization, one is very concerned with the nature of agency and what human role has played in constructing the moves, the directions that have been taken. So using the term selection is still suggesting in some way, I mean, who's doing the selection? I mean, it's also, so such and such is selected, nature selects. Yes. That kind of, doesn't that embody nature and give it a personality in some way?
It shouldn't. I mean, one, you know, I've got two boys, 9 and 6, and you read them books, how the elephant got its trunk or whatever it may be. It drives me up the wall, actually. I really hate these books now. I want to tell them an evolutionary narrative, but the trouble is that it's about populations over time, and small children don't understand time. They've got absolutely no concept of 2 weeks or a year or 200 years or 2,000 years. Try them on 65 million years or something. It's just a completely meaningless term. They can use the word, but they don't know what it means. And populations as well. What's selecting It's just difference in survival. The ones that are less good in that particular set of conditions die. The ones that don't die may reproduce themselves. So there is no agency, but again, this narrative storytelling animal wants to see an agency, wants to tell a story. Here's this animal, it got its trunk, and then all the rest of the elephants got their trunk because its father has its trunk pulled by a crocodile or whatever it may be. So we really find we struggle to get away to think in terms of population dynamics and statistics. They're just not easy terms for humans to deal with, but that's the real level of explanation.
And James or Michael, do you want to say anything about this issue of the difficulties of metaphor?
No, I don't have a particularly strong view on that particular question. I would like to respond at some point to the earlier question about linkages, because what I tried to present in the structure of my own talk was both the link to the idea of significant transitions in the organisation of life, by pointing out that when we think about the appearance of anatomically modern humans, this is sometimes always associated either with language or with consciousness, each of which, depending on which book you read, appears as the last major transition in terms of organisational principle. And at the same time, when we think about cumulative cultural evolution, we're beginning to think about the external storage of information that's culturally learned that can be passed on. Language is a store of information as well as a means of building social contracts and so on. And so that would provide, to my mind, a bridge to the work on civilization, if I'm thinking of civilization. Which is primarily to do, for example, with literacy and other ways of storing information beyond the oral exchange verbally. And so, to answer your question, I think what I've pitched is to try and build those two bridges. And so for me, the interesting research question is it true that there's a qualitative change, whether it's with modern humans or with some earlier species, associated with the emergence of what we would recognise as language? Does consciousness, as we call it, that's to say, rational, reflective, higher order analysis of associations and causal mechanisms, also require language? Is it, as it were, internal speaking that's the mechanism of that kind of function? So to me, this is an interesting research problem. Yeah. And at the same time, with the work that, again, my learned colleague Stephen and others are doing on the mechanisms of accumulation of cultural knowledge, and in particular working on demography as a complement to the cognitive and the linguistic adaptations that the individual may possess, thinking about whether one should start thinking about the history of forms of useful knowledge, and the history of, I mean, to my mind, what we see in the appearance of anatomically modern humans, and what we call modern behaviour, is knowledge forms that are going beyond the purely instrumental. So we're starting to see ideas about the spirit world, ideas about death and afterlife and so on. And I would think of that as a way of system building. Whether it's through metaphor, there's something going on there that's about systematic construction of bodies of knowledge that's rather interesting. So sorry if that's a slight digression from where we were going, but that's where I would see as the interesting research questions from my take on a much larger topic, human evolution, that relate to the two other speakers today.
Thank you. Yes. I think we've only got a few minutes left, so perhaps we should try and take a couple more questions. I think you were waiting, yes.
Thanks. Isn't it quite dangerous to accept the thing you mentioned of the meta-narrative of progress as being a sort of unitary thing, and the dominant idea of progress, like exemplified by what Bill Gates said, because that's actually a very narrow concept, isn't it? And perhaps not a very realistic one, except maybe from a mega-rich entrepreneur's perspective. I mean, don't we have to have some counter-narratives? Because what his ideas about the world don't necessarily bring benefit to a lot of people on the planet, and you could come up with other examples. For example, you could say there's great technological progress in being able to get oil out of the ground, and that may be based partly on some humans improving the way they learn, over time. But what about the fact that within company cultures, for example, what happens to the ground and the people who live on it is often ignored. So don't we need some counter ideas of progress? I mean, I guess, you know, from the 18th century onwards, there were attempts at universalism, and a lot of postmodern theory has kind of countered that, but nonetheless, we have huge problems on the planet, don't we? Like you mentioned, climate change and pollution is another one. So don't we need some counter-narratives, different types of progress?
We've had many counter-narratives. I mean, in that 200 years, and I think we can extend it in terms of other record much, in terms of morality and things into much earlier times as well. So I think the interesting thing is, no matter how much one attacks and deconstructs the narratives of progress, they are there. We never get rid of them. They're totalizing. They have enormous power. And then the interesting question is, why? And what do they do? What do they do for us? By having this kind of, capacity to, comfort us? Or to bring into some kind of inclusive sense, sort of all the big problems so that we can sense that they're under control. Which frankly I think these metaphors like consciousness and being able to see the sort of the symbolic break, sort of with modern humans, is part of our own obsession with those kind of narratives as well. We want to be able to see ourselves as something containable, within which, that kind of container, some kind of investigation. So it's the power of it. I mean, come to Wang Yiming's lecture on February the 13th, where after all the 20th century events of China, what we have? We'll have 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. I mean, he'll be very critical of it, because he's been here and can. But I mean, look at the opening of the Beijing Olympics and what that was all about. It was simply referring back to 5,000 years of Chinese civilization as being the now of China. No mention of Mao, no mention of the Communist Party, no mention of any of the terrible events of the 20th century in China. Not just the Cultural Revolution, but Great Leap Forward. 20 million, 30 million people died in the Great Leap Forward after all, within 2 years, which I have no mention of at all. So these narratives about progress, and China is that. I mean, the narrative is we had 100 years of being under the thrall of colonialists and people from outside. We are now progressing. And my goodness, you have no idea what that will be, because we are trying to anticipate what it will be in the future, but we only do it by looking back as 5,000 years of Chinese history. Those are the powers of these narratives, which I think are very important.
I think at this point, on the reference to the powers of narrative and that rather eloquent and moving plug for the lecture on February the 13th, we're sadly going to have to stop because the room is going to be in use at 7 o'clock. But I would like to say thank you all really very, very much for coming, and I hope you see this as an example of the kind of connections between different aspects of research at UCL that can generate some really interesting debates and some real possibilities for collaboration and, I better not say progress in research in the future. So thank you very much indeed for coming, and could we just thank our speakers?